had the dropped calls, right? Or have played the "Can You Hear Me Now" game, right? So yesterday I was driving my daughter down to Pittsburgh Airport, and on my way home, my wife had to get a hold of me for something very urgent, the grocery list. And so I'm coming down into town, but I was still out in the hilly area past Lewis Run, and she calls me up, and she's like, "Hey, Mike, are you there?" I'm like, "Hon, I can't hear you. You're breaking up real bad." And I'm like, "Can you hear me?" And she's going, "I can hear you. Can you get from Walmart?" Right? And I'm like, come on, I'm like, certainly we don't have a bad connection in this area. And she's like, I'll call you back. So she tries calling me back, and same thing. We had this "Can You Hear Me Now" game going on, and this time we actually lost signal. And, it was a bit frustrating because, when you're driving down the road in that particular area, it isn't an area that you would think is going to be a major problem. I mean, you have hills and stuff like that, but you just don't think that this is going to be an area when you're so close to town that you're going to be struggling with that. But haven't we all been there where we get the dropped calls, or we get the "Can You Hear Me Now" game going on, right? And the deal is, it's a low signal problem, right? We have this low signal, and do you want to know what the issue is with low signal? In your outlines, you'll notice that low signal is a proximity issue. Low signal is a proximity issue. And a lot of times when we can't hear that person and the phone conversation is breaking up, we start getting frustrated, we start getting angry, and we get our anger directed at the phone sometimes, right? Like we want to throw this phone out the window or throw it on the ground and throw a fit and stomp it into death, right? But the problem isn't the phone. The problem is not the phone. The problem is our proximity to the source of the signal, right? It's our proximity. So whether you're using a laptop and you're trying to log on to Wi-Fi and you have a low signal there, well, it's a proximity issue. You're not near the router. You got to get closer. And when you're out and about, driving through hills and tunnels and valleys, guess what? There's going to be proximity issues. Yes, there are barriers that get in the way as well, but it's ultimately coming down to a proximity issue and how near or far you are and what's coming between you and the source of that signal. And our prayer lives are a lot like that. How many have ever gotten bad reception with God? Right? Like you're not hearing him clearly. How many have ever got the dropped call with God? You put it out there, but you're not sure you were heard. And if you were heard, you don't think he's getting the message. He's not answering, right? Why is it that we're not hearing clearly? Why is it we're not seeing clearly when God is at work and in the ways that he's working in our lives? And it has to do with a proximity issue. Now, I'm going to share with you an illustration from Luke chapter 15, a story that shows us how this proximity issue works. But before I do, I want to remind you that communication with God, prayer, we're talking about prayer, our prayer life, which is us having a conversation with God, opens a line of communication. We learned this last week. And that line of communication is the channel through which resources flow, right? So in military terms, a line of communication is a line through which resources flow. And sometimes the resource is information, intelligence. Other times the resource is material provision, ammunition, food, blankets, and so on. Other times it's people resources, it's backup, it's protection. And so you've got troops coming. That's a line of communication. And in our lives, the same thing is true. As you and I open up the line of communication with God and we start talking with God, praying, guess what? We're asking him, right? We're little bird to mama's nest, right? We need reinforcements. We need help. We need guidance. We need provision. We need healing. You name it. We need deliverance. So Here's the thing. Sometimes we struggle with hearing clearly. Sometimes we struggle with seeing those resources flow freely into our lives. And we need to understand that it's a proximity issue. In Luke chapter 15, there's a very, very famous story that Jesus told. If you've been around the church for any length of time, you've probably heard it many times. And even if you haven't been around church hardly at all, maybe not at all, you might have still heard this story. It's that famous. It's oftentimes referred to as the story of the prodigal son, but in truth, there are two prodigals in this story, and we'll talk about that in a moment. But here's how the story goes. Jesus starts to tell the story saying one time there was this dad. And this dad had two sons, and the two sons, one older, one younger, they're not twins, right? So the older child was the compliant child. He was the good boy. He was the guy that hung around and did his chores and did what he was told. And he was responsible, right? Obedient. The other one, the younger one, wild child. You know, always looking for the opportunity to kind of live the adventure, break free from mom and dad's, restrictions and prison. All of these rules, all these responsibilities, do this, do that, chores here, chores there, right? So he finally got old enough where he could say, hey, I'm done. I want to go do my own thing. So he approaches his dad and he said, listen, Dad, thank you for everything, but one last request. I want to leave, and I'd like you to give me my inheritance now. Let me go. So the dad says, okay. So he figures it out, gives the kid his half of the inheritance, and away he goes. And Jesus said he didn't just go a little ways. He didn't go downtown. He didn't go to a neighboring city. Jesus said he went a long way off to a distant land. And in that distant land, it says that he pretty much abandoned any kind of discipline or responsibility or moral ethic, that he lived it up in what Jesus described as wild living. All that he had, he spent on women, on drink and food, partying it up, surrounded by buddies, he thought, until he was out of money. And when he was finally bankrupt and had nothing to his name, all the people that he thought were friends, all the people that were living it up with him, that had his back, were nowhere to be found. So now he's alone. And he's broke, and he's broke in. He's destitute. And have you ever noticed that when you're down, like things tend to go from bad to worse? What's up with that? And that's exactly what happens. Things go from bad to worse. Not only is he now destitute, no clothes, no money, no food, and no shelter, but now a famine hits the land. And in this place, nobody is willing to give him anything, to the point that he's starving and nearing death, is how Jesus described it. So he knew that he couldn't just lie there and die. He had that survival instinct. And so it says that he looked around for work, and he finally found someone who was willing to give him this one job. And that one job was to feed the pigs. Now, I grew up farming, and I can tell you there's nothing attractive about pig food. But this guy was so desperate, so broken, so destitute, that in his place of severe hunger, he looked at that pig food and he actually thought, there's dinner. And then Jesus uses this phrase. He said, and then he came to his senses. And there's like this light bulb that goes on in us, right? This awakening that takes place. And he said that the young man had a conversation with himself, and it kind of went like this. Self, how many hired servants, employees at my father's house are starving? None. How many employees at my father's house are naked or without shelter? None. How many are alone and facing the harsh cruelness of this world all by themselves and being broken by it? None. So he said, self, it's time to go home.